Well, yes, thank you very much, everyone. Yeah, just nice to be finishing off on a not controversial note by doing something like Revelation and the Apocalypse and all that kind of thing. I was saying to someone before the talk, it's one of those things where if you say something controversial, you get yourself into trouble. But actually, by definition, even if I try to say something that is actually uncontroversial about Revelation, that in itself is controversial. So I can't win either way, which is just great, what you want whenever you're going into a talk. To be honest, I think that my approach to Revelation that I'll go through tonight is actually remarkably, not bland, but just, it's not as exciting as, say, a Hal Lindsey, if any of you are familiar with that term. I'm really, pretty light on this kind of stuff, and that in itself can be somewhat controversial. So I want to start by recognising that this is an apologetics group. Okay, so most of our talks are actually about apologetics. So while on one level, you and I, I'm just going to talk to the Christians for 2 seconds. Now, the Christians who are here, you and I, we can have a belter of an argument about dispensationalism versus amillennialism versus all the rest of the funky stuff. And we'll just have a ripper of a yarn afterwards, and you can rip my face off, and it'll be a fun time. But what I want to do is propose that there are actually apologetic problems that emerge around eschatological stuff. Just practically speaking, when we're talking to non-Christians and we're talking about this kind of stuff, it can create a lot of problems in terms of being an impediment to people accepting the gospel. It can lead to ridicule for the gospel. And so if what I'm doing tonight, I guess, is approaching the topic from an apologist's point of view. How are we best going to give an answer for our faith that is around the whole eschatology stuff? Because if you're a non-Christian and you hear some of the stuff that's going on with Christians around this kind of stuff, it can be a major impediment to them accepting the gospel or a point of ridicule. Do you get what I mean? If you don't worry, because I'm going to spend a little bit of time telling you about that. Apart from anything, I just want to recognise first and foremost the whole concept of apocalyptic literature is just plain freaking weird for most people. Let's just recognise that. Dragons and stuff and stuff like that. That's going to be somewhat hard for certain people to accept and wrestle with. And we have to just start by Jesus always meets people where they're at. And if where people are at is, you're talking about dragons to me, you're talking about two witnesses and stuff like that, that might not necessarily be the best platform to begin things. Now, I will preface and say in some cases it might be, but yeah. The key thing, though, that I think is an issue that we're wrestling with here is the way that apocalyptic emphases can discredit the credibility of Christianity. Okay? And here's why. Because when we start to interpret and guess around when Jesus is coming back, that's really like, it's 100 to 1 bet. And you're putting $1 million down on it. If you lose, from a credibility point of view, you lose big. Okay? So, if you want to look like an idiot, predict that Jesus will come back yesterday. Okay? Right? Os Guinness, in his wonderful book, one of my favourite books of all time, Fit Bodies, Fat Minds, Why Evangelicals Don't Think and What to Do About It. It's just worth it for the title, isn't it? He wrote this: a recurring feature of dispensational populism is its careless crossover between the Bible and historical events of its day. At its worst, the the result is what Francis Schaeffer, a premillennialist himself, called the "this is that" fallacy. Now, if you don't know what dispensationalism and premillennialism is, don't worry about that for the moment, okay? This fallacy is to think that this event in our time is the fulfillment of that prophecy in the Bible. Every generation and speaker, for example, points to its own proof-texted beyond any doubt Antichrist. In my lifetime, they've included people as diverse as Adolf Hitler, Henry Kissinger, and Saddam Hussein. And all of you know exactly what I mean. You know, like, it was a tough sell to figure out which Antichrist we were going to get in 2016. It was either Hillary or it was Donald, and we just couldn't... I mean, whichever one, we pretty much knew that they were the Antichrist. It was just a question of which, you know, that kind of a thing. So part of his point here is that none of those people are the Antichrist. That's what he's trying to argue. He's saying none of those are the Antichrist. All of them, people put their bandwagon on and said, oh, Adolf Hitler's the Antichrist. Therefore, Jesus is coming back tomorrow. Henry Kissinger, Jesus is coming back tomorrow. You know, Gorbachev would be another example of that. Jesus is coming back tomorrow. You know, Saddam Hussein, Jesus is coming back tomorrow. This kind of a thing. And his point, and central to Os Guinness's point, is that none of those guys actually turned out to be that guy. So therefore, Christians ended up having egg on their face. I remember seeing Fred Nile, if you're familiar with Fred. Fred, in 1984, I think it was 1984, it was certainly the early 80s, being on national Australian television and saying, I've consulted with experts and we're absolutely certain Jesus will come back at, certainly before 1990, probably around about 1988. That don't look good, right? That just doesn't look good. And from an apologetics point of view, it affects the credibility of our message. And it means that we now have to figure out how we're going to defend the gospel with that. One option is to kind of go, no, well, he got it wrong, but the rest of it's right, which never sounds great. You know what I mean? Right? Now, that's in terms of the apologetics that we do to non-Christians, the ridicule that we could be facing because of that. And to be honest, it's not like you can ridicule Christians for all kinds of funky stuff that we do that you think is weird. We don't need to give people extra reasons to come up with... They're going to find plenty of things to rag us about without that. Okay? Why give them an own goal? Okay? Don't do... So that's the first thing. But then, of course, the other thing about apologetics is not always specifically designed for non-Christians. Actually, a lot of the apologetics that we do is about defending the faith for Christians who themselves are wrestling with their Christian identity, their Christian beliefs. They're not sure. You know, part of the importance of apologetics is that we actually can speak to the problems that not only non-Christians have with aspects of our faith, but that Christians themselves wrestle with. And there are two common problems that Christians face from this point. The first one is this. Right? This is a picture of a guy called William Miller and his group. So William Miller, any of you guys ever heard of the Millerites? Right, so the Millerites were a group from the late 30s, 40s. Miller was from an evangelical church, passionate Bible-believing church, and he became increasingly schismatic, you might even say sectarian, started his own group, and it was primarily based around eschatology. And it increasingly came to the point where, having done a bit of what Schaeffer and Guinness described as the this or that fallacy, they had identified there's this part of the Bible, there's this going on, therefore this is that, Jesus is coming back. And having consulted with their own experts, they identified that Jesus was coming back very specifically to a field in the middle of Northwest America because where else would he land? And it was going to be on October 22nd, 1844. People sold their houses. People gave everything they had away. Why would you want it anymore? People threw away their entire livelihoods, quit their jobs, all the rest of it, and walked out into a field and looked up and just waited all flipping day. That day is now known as you can see there, the Great Disappointment. The Millerites actually subsequently became two major denominations. I use the term denomination somewhat loosely for one of them, and that is the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Seventh-day Adventists. Now, if you talk to any J-dubs, they say, I don't know what you're talking about, this whole pesky thing. I don't know. What? Because it's a bit embarrassing. If you sit down with an SDA long enough, you might get them to admit it as well. It's a bit awkward. To identify one of the key major moments in your denomination's founding to be, well, that, in great. But the key thing I want to focus on here is that then everyone had to go on the 23rd and go to the person that they just sold their house to for a nickel and say, can I have my house back? They had to go to their boss and they say, I know I said up yours, but I thought the end of the world was nigh and I could get away with it. Can I have my job back? The amount of ridicule that these people were endured was horrific. And it meant that there were three options. One option was that they gave the game away completely and they stopped being Christians. Two, they went with their tails between their legs back into churches, and people who had been once very passionate about their faith, very adamant, very active, went with their tail between their legs and quietly sat in the back of the pew for a long, long time and ceased to actually be significant contributors to the kingdom of God. Or the third option was they joined a cult, which certainly the JW could say that, and depending on your point of view around the SDA, certainly for a long time afterwards, the Seventh-day Adventists were highly doctrinally problematic. This is not a good outcome from apocalypticism or this is that theology. Now, I use this as an example. I could have used countless examples. This is specific, but it's highly indicative. Within my own PhD research, I looked at the Baptists, and as I've talked about in several other contexts, including here, the 1600s within English Protestantism was dominated by eschatological stuff, and sometimes that turned out to be really cool. In some cases, it led to them beheading a king. It led to all manner of significant problems societally, and it significantly damaged the credibility of the gospel. So, faced with the disastrous consequences of having chucked out a bit of this is that theology and got it wrong, what is the alternative? Well, I'll tell you what the most common alternative to that is, and it's this. Denying it entirely. This is one of my favourite little cartoons. Now, for all of you amils out there, yes, it's the rapture, so it's talking from a pre-mill perspective. Just roll past that. What I want you to get is the image that this is fundamentally, what's its point? Its point is this. Jesus is calling people back, and they're using the term the rapture for that. But Jesus is coming home. The end of the world isn't nigh, it's now in this thing. And just as Jesus comes back, there's a bunch of people who go, I really want to, Jesus, but can you just wait that little bit longer? Why? Because I've got a really high score going here. Now look at the other people. The guy with the Lamborghini. I just paid off the final payment. This thing can get from 1 to 150 in 2 seconds. What? No, just let me get one more go around the block. We've got the guy. Do you know how hard it is to get into this country club? I've been waiting years, and I was playing under 3, right? Just a little bit longer, Jesus. We've got the guy there holding onto his house. I just got the new carpets put in. We've got the other woman, the woman holding the turkey. It's basting so well. Just a little longer, Jesus. And the guy up the back holding onto his computer. All right? I'm just about to finish my world-class novel. Everyone reads it, but not when you come back. Just hold off a little. Now, the point that it's making ultimately is, as Christians, are we in the position where we have sold the farm a little? Jesus said to us, right, bed down. I'm coming. Wait for me. When I come back, don't be found sleeping. Don't be just mucking around. Don't change allegiances to the prevailing government around you. Because when I come, you don't want to be like that faithless steward, the unfaithful steward. Do you remember that guy? I'm talking to the Christians here, right? Who, having been told, by the master, I am leaving you here to take care of the farm. Take care of it. Look after my servants. Look after me. I will come back. He goes off and the servant goes, well, he's gone. Best have fun while I'm here. I'm in charge. I can do whatever I want. They don't realise that when that master comes back, he's going to say, what have you done? And all of the rest of the servants are going to go, actually, he was a real tool. Is that what we're doing? See, the temptation seems to be 2 extremes. One extreme is for us as Christians to run into this and that fallacies, reading Revelation and going, aha, aha, and then what happens is that we get to the point where we have the kind of great disappointment type stuff. The alternative is we become embarrassed about people like that, and so we deny the reality that Jesus will come back at all, ever, in any way, shape or form that actually means we change the way we live our lives. So then what happens is that we embed ourselves in the local, in the state, in the government, in the powers that be, within the rulers of our age, whether they be money or sex or power or influence or any of the rest of the things. We choose to embed ourselves in those because they're at least here. And we're not really sure that he's going to come back. Every other time that someone said he was going to come back, he didn't. So clearly, do you see what I mean? These are the 2 key risks that we have to avoid. The reason why I say this is important is you can see it in the way that we handle revelation in our churches. I was talking to someone about their denomination beforehand, and we're saying how rarely revelation is actually read in their denomination. Now, to be honest, that's true of most denominations, isn't it? Luther actually expressly went out of his way to forbid people from reading and preaching from Revelation, mainly because there was a heck of a lot of quite violent expressions of this or that, this is that theology during his day. So the extremes of apocalyptic madness or just apocalyptic avoidance seem to be the 2 main options that we play with. So part of what I'm doing tonight is I'm not really interested in talking about the subtleties of dispensationalism over amillennialism or anything like that. What I'm trying to do is create a little bit of middle ground that allows for some degree of credibility for both when we're presenting the gospel to other people, but also for ourselves. Okay? something that still keeps our eye just over the horizon. See, there's not much difference, but there is every difference between saying Jesus will come back tomorrow and saying he might. There's a big difference between he will and he'll never, but he might. That's the key one. What you find is that people often who run to the he will get disappointed, the great disappointment. Or they go the other way and they go the he won't. And then they embed. And that's when things get messy. What we're looking for is a thing that catches our eye regularly and causes us to think, how am I living my life today? And Jesus might not come back tomorrow, but if he did, what would that mean for me? Now the thing is, Revelation itself is actually surprisingly designed for that very purpose. And we'll see how in a minute. But before we get to Revelation, I want to actually start with a bit of a premise before that, and that is, in the Bible, what actually is the end of the world? When is the end of the world? Here's the thing that I want you to realise. The end of the world is quite explicitly described in the New Testament. Quite explicitly. And this is what it says. Right? To help you with that, actually before we get to the New Testament, I want to show you two pictures. And I want you to, now this is for the history buffs. Okay, now it's World War II history, so it's kind of cool. So some of you will know this. Okay, it's not obscure Bavarian history or something. Okay. What are these two events? Anyone know? Anyone know what these two events are? Yep.
Yes, surrender.
Okay, so can you say that first one for us?
D-Day.
D-Day. All right? Normandy. That's Normandy. All right, and more specifically, when in Normandy? When in D-Day? The beginning of D-Day or the end of it? It's the end of it. Okay, I could have got the cool picture of the guys in the boats kind of coming out, but I didn't choose that. I chose this one. And what's that one? That is Berlin. That is Berlin at... Right? Yeah. That is Berlin at the end of the war. Now, one of the fun things that historians talk about with World War II, and we'll talk about the European war here for a minute, leave the Japanese war out for a minute. One of the interesting questions that historians of the European war will often play around with is, when did the war end? When was the end of the war, the European war? Ostensibly, on one level, it was in Berlin. But for all intents and purposes, the war ended at Normandy. Everything else after that was just mopping up. Sure, there was fights and there were little battles and, you know, some of the Allies died and stuff like that, but effectively it was done. It was won, it was over, and everything else was mopping up. Do you understand what I mean? All right? So during those brief months between Normandy and Berlin, you could call that, the technical term for it is a liminal period, or a period in between. Okay? Now, when we talk about the end of the world within the New Testament, what do we find? Well, the end of the world you can hear and see in Pentecost. And let me explain. Let's read this from Acts 2. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. And all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. It fascinates me that this text is not more definitive to how we understand the rest of the Bible. Right? I'm not even Pentecostal, and even I can see that. Okay? Now, The point is, after that, they go out and they start proclaiming, and everyone goes, what on earth does this mean? Like, why are these people speaking in all these tongues and everything like that? And so Peter stands up to explain, right? Then Peter stood up with the 11, the other disciples, raised his voice and addressed the crowd. Fellow Jews and all of you who live in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say. What is actually going on here? And he explains that he's not drunk. And then what he does is he says, no, this right here, this moment, what you are seeing right there at that moment is what? It is what was spoken by the prophet Joel in the last days. Not, this is what's going to happen in a long time. No, Peter's point is right then, at that second, is the last days. In the last days, God says, I will do what? Pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy, your young men will see visions, your old men will dream dreams, even on my servants, both men and women. Point I often make. I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. So the key thing you need to know, by the definition of Joel, and therefore of Peter, is that how do you know the end of the world has come? It's when God pours his spirit onto his people. And lo and behold, that's what he's doing. That's the first point. But he goes on. He gives a little bit more detail from that Joel passage, and then he says, fellow Israelites, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. Now, what you have to understand about early New Testament culture, Jewish culture, is that central to them was the idea of the resurrection. The resurrection of the dead, the resurrection of Israel as a kick-butt nation. Okay? And they had a lot of Old Testament bits, not least of all Joel, that pointed to that moment being, right? How would you know the end of the world would come? You'd know two things. The Spirit would pour himself on all people, and the dead would rise. So if you want to know what the last days are for Paul, and for Peter, and for the early Christians, the last days are those days where the dead come back to life, and the Spirit is poured out on all people. And his point is, Jesus has come back to life. So the end of the world is here. Now the problem that we have is that we go, no, that's only a 24-hour period, right? The end of the world, no. The end of the world, it has to be a really fast period. You know, like it's got to be, you look, the clouds, we're all off. Okay? Look, the Son of Man is coming on the clouds, woof, we're done. But that's not how the New Testament frames it. The New Testament frames it that it is more like Normandy to Berlin. It's the last days. It's not last day. It's a period. And so therefore we are in the period between two kind of last days, if you like. The beginning of the last days and the end of it. Okay? So several things with that I want to stress. One, if you want to throw me something like, I don't know, 1 Corinthians 15 or something like that, where he says that there are people who say that the resurrection's already happened or that there's no resurrection. Neither of those things is what I'm saying. Okay? You've got to understand which resurrections he's talking about there. That's the first point. The second point is that on one level you might think this is somewhat arbitrary, but it's quite an important point. And the reason is because what it means is that we're sitting here between two very major events, the beginning of the last days and the end of them. And we live within the tension of those. And just as at Normandy, they still have to fight the Germans. We live in the time where on one level, the battle is won, dude. Jesus has won the battle. There is no fight no more. On a whole host of levels, it's done. But on another level, we are still going to have to be in the mopping up process. And unfortunately, that mopping up process is 2018 years and running. Okay? So when you're hearing the Bible talk about the last days or the end times or the return or those kind of things, you've got to be very careful as to whether it's talking about when Jesus comes the first time, which inaugurates the last days, when he ultimately comes back, which is like the big kahuna, and I really defend that's a reality, that will happen, or whether he's talking about the time in between that we're all living in and wrestling with. Do you see what I mean? Right? I could have used other passages. What does Jesus say when the Pharisees come to him and say, when's the kingdom coming? In Luke 17. His response is, the kingdom is among you right now. You want to know when the end of the world is coming? It's here, dude. Why? Because I'm here. I'm God and I've come down onto earth. This is the inauguration of the last days. It's here. When's it coming? It is. Right? So there's lots of this talk. So when you're reading passages, you've got to ask yourself, is it the end, the beginning of the end, or the stuff in between? Right? So, now let's get to Revelation, because that might help us. Let's go to Revelation 6. Well, actually, let's not. Let's start by actually looking at Revelation 1. Because before you start looking at things like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, it might be handy to spend a little bit of time looking at what the book says about itself more broadly. And this is what... John gets this vision and he sees Jesus. And it ain't the Jesus that he saw when he was running around in Nazareth in Galilee. It's a much bigger, scarier Jesus. It's the same guy, but Jesus has shown himself in his true power and nature in front of John, which is pretty amazing. And he freaks out, as any of us would. And then, this is what Jesus tells John. He says, don't be afraid, which is a fair thing to point out. Okay, do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. From a Jewish perspective, that is end times language. The resurrection has happened. I'm proof of the resurrection. I just came back. Right? Right, therefore, what you have seen, and here's the key bit that we often miss, what is now and what will take place later. So, let's stress this. Revelation is not a step-by-step map of the last week or two before Jesus comes back, like at the end of the story, last days. What it is the story of what life is like for the entirety of these last days. Okay? What you'll see now and what you'll see towards the end. Now, don't get me wrong, by about Revelation 20, it kicks in full on to Jesus has come back and now we're off to the races. Evil is punished, we live in eternity, everything like that. But between then, 19 through to, say, 4, is actually about what life is like for us now that we have found ourselves in these last days, this period between the beginning of the last days and the end of them. We've got the Spirit, right? He has been poured upon his people. So we know that we're in those last days period by Joel's definition. The dead have begun to arise because Jesus has. Now they haven't all arisen, that's at the end. So we're in this period in between. And he says the whole point of Revelation is to help you to understand how to live right now in this period. Right? So, therefore, Revelation is a powerfully artistic description of what life is constantly like for us while we live in the end of the world. We're living in the end of the world. It is a call to perseverance, a word that regularly occurs, just over. And I mean, any of you guys reading Revelation recently? It's Advent, surely some of you, right? How often do you hear this call to persevere? Just hold on, be determined, don't let go, be victorious. Victory is fundamentally defined in Revelation by the process of sticking fat and holding on in the midst of pain. Don't give up. You will find it terribly hard and you will find it demoralizing, defeating. You will constantly feel like you are losing. Don't give up. Okay? I was recently reflecting a bit of Greek. So do you know... You know the word for... you know how Paul talks about he'll run the race? He's run the race. The word for that in Greek is agonas, where we get a real fun word, agony. Now, Paul actually has a couple of words that he could have used for race. They've got quite a few words for running and racing. But agonas. And agonas is very specifically about the painful, agonizing, why am I still running race? And Paul's whole point is, I have found myself in the last days. I'm not waiting for the last days. I'm in them. And it sucks. It's really painful. It's really not fun. I'm about to get my head chopped off. Not a good day. But I have run the race, and and from that I get the crown. I get the victory. I get the glory. Right? So, coming back to Revelation, Revelation is a story, is a way of getting people thinking about, so will you do what Paul did? Will you do what Peter did? Will you run the race? Will you run it and stay fat, stay strong, not give up? Will you persevere? So, how's he going to explain that to people? A lot of New Testament scholars who have studied Revelation now identify that there's actually quite a consistent, though general, pattern to it. Okay? So what I basically articulate that. And any of you guys who go through, read Revelation afterwards, you'll see what I mean. It starts in Revelation 4 and 5, in this respect, with God wins. Okay? Everyone's you remember that, like everyone's worshipping God and God has won. And the one time where everyone's worried about whether God has won is whether he can open the scroll. Well, the scroll represents all manner of things, but one of the things it represents is there's a risk. Can God actually lose here? And we find out the Lamb comes, and that's actually Jesus. And Jesus says, no, I can handle the scroll. I can take it. Jesus wins. God wins. It's all cool. So it starts on the premise that God wins. God's won. Doesn't that remind you of what I was talking about before? The resurrection's already happened. God's won. The Lamb was slain and he came again. God's won. Normandy's won. So then what happens is that you move from that into the passage that we'll look at now. And things look really bad. And they get worse. And they get worse, and they get worse. And then what happens is that they get so bad that the Christians actually really start to look like they're going to lose their feet here. They're going to get completely smashed out. And then what happens? God wins. Often inexplicably. Like there's no, tussle or anything like that. It's kind of like, wow, things are looking really bad for the Christians. I hope they can hold on. It's not looking good. Wait, God just won. And then it starts again. God won. Then there's a crisis, then there's a problem, then there's someone really scary, there's a dragon or whatever. And then it's looking real bad for the Christians. I hope they can hold on, it's not looking good, I don't know. God won. And they won too. What? Oh, but then there's another crisis and everything's going bad and I'm not really sure about this. I'm not sure how can the Christians hold on? I'm not really thinking. God won. And the Christians won too. Oh, and it actually goes around in this cycle. And so what it's actually doing is showing you this is just the way the wheel turns in the last days. And all you have to do is know that if you stick fat and you hold tight and you persevere, you will win. Because Christ has already won. So then the question is, people will say, well, how? How does it look? And this is where we come to Revelation 6. See, I spent a lot of time getting up there, and I recognise that. But I hope that having given you all of that premise and everything, allows you to come into this text with a much clearer idea of what's going on. So, now let's go into Revelation 6. I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals, and then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. Keep that last little bit in your head, okay? When the Lamb opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature say, "Come." Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. When the Lamb opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures saying, 900 grams, a little less than a kilo, of wheat for a day's wages, and 2.7 kilograms of barley for a day's wages, and don't damage the oil and the wine. Now, obviously, I didn't use kilograms. I'm just making it more approachable for you. And then the last one. When the Lamb opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. And they were given power over 1/4 of the earth to kill by sword, famine and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. Okay, so what are the 4 horsemen? 1, a dictator. 2, a war. 3, famine. 4, disease and death. Okay, you with me? Now, if you're asking the question, right, who's the dictator? Who's the dictator? Let's come back to that Oz Guinness question before. Who is it? Which guy is it? Is it Adolf Hitler? Is it Henry Kissinger? Is it Saddam Hussein? Which one is it? And you say, yep. That's actually his answer. Yep. No. Which one is it? Is it that one or that one or that? And he goes, yep. And you go, what do you mean? And he says, because this is what happens all the time. Think about it for a minute. What happens? Dictators rise up in society all the time. Certainly in their day, but even today. People find themselves attracted to a person who is highly military and highly aggressive, and he takes over. He kills all his enemies, and then they're done. They rise and they become rulers. What do most rulers do throughout history? As soon as they're ruling, they look to rule more. So what do? They find other rulers who also want to do that, and what do they start to do? They have wars. It is a natural consequence of having dictators that wars will begin. Now, what happens when you have a lot of war? Well, troops come running through your town and they don't bring their own supplies. Whose supplies do they take? Yours. And you know what's been a very effective way of destroying nations and bringing them under your knees over the journey? Going through their crops and burning them. Now, you take away all the food of a community and you burn away all of their future crops, that's not going to be good. it will lead to severe famine and malnutrition until they get another whole year to grow their food. Right? Now, if you have severe malnutrition, what will happen? Right? So that actually comes to the next one. What was point 3? 3 was famine. You're paying, how much is a kilo of flour at Woolies or whatever? A couple of bucks? You're paying, let's put the average national wage at the moment at something like what? Maybe $200-300 a day? Maybe, let's go with that. So you're paying 100, maybe, 200 times what you should pay. You know when you have to pay that much for food? When it's in demand. That's what that one's about. It's about famine. People are starving to death. They have no money, they have no food, and they're having to use all their money to buy what little food they have. So then they're malnourished, and what happens when people are malnourished? They get sick, and then they die. So, when will this happen? Dude, find me when it's not. Find me a time when we don't have the rise of dictators causing war, causing subsequent famine, causing disease and death. Find me when that's not happening. It's happening all the time. Okay? So his point isn't that it's the horsemen, it's that this is a pattern that we'll see again and again and again and again and again in this last period. And the response of us as Christians is not to go, well, God's gone. God's lost. It's all over. The world's gone. We're doomed. We're doomed. No. Who opens the seals? The Lamb does. The Lamb's got this. This is all part of his plan. Now, you might be sitting there and going, it's a pretty rough plan, but, well, that's not actually your job, and we'll look at that in a minute, in a second. The point is that God's got this. You might think that the world is going, and you might be tempted when you see the world going all messed up to do what? Give up. But his point is, don't give up. Persevere, because Jesus has got this, and he will come back. And he will make everything right. Now, if you're sitting there and you're going, gee, that's a bit rough that God would be doing this, what on earth justification could he have for that? Well, it's very interesting to see what is the very last part of this passage. Once you get past the whole sexiness of the 4 horsemen, most people just give up and they don't really check anymore. Well, look what the last part is. Right? When he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained. They called out in a long voice, "How long, Sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" Then each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the full number of their fellow servants, their brothers and sisters, were killed, just as they had been. You have to understand that Revelation is written in a period of profound trauma for Christians. And they are trying to make sense of that profound trauma and how it can make sense in the midst of the pain and the injustice that they are facing from a dictatorial government. Okay? They're trying to make sense of that. And so Revelation is a way of them exploring that constructively, artistically, but constructively. And one of the points that he wants to make is that, when these people who have gone before them, who have faced injustice and suffering, and that's not an abstract thing for them. We read that, and we read about those who have been slain, and we think people that we never knew. They know those people. They know those people personally. When one of John's readers reads this, they picture people that they have known who have had this happen to them. So when they do that, they're saying, it's not just the dead saints who are saying that, it's actually the people who are reading it who are saying, yeah, damn it, when Uncle Tom was killed, when Uncle Phil, when Paul, when Peter were executed for their faith, how are you going to make that right? And John and God's answer in this is, I am making it right. I will send dictators and war and pestilence, and I will bring about justice for what has happened to you. Now, you might not like that justice, you might disagree with it and that kind of thing. I respect that. But I would suggest you are not necessarily, whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian, in the position to understand that the way that these people understand it in the midst of their trauma. So, and what's he wanting to say? What is God and John wanting to say to his people? He's wanting to say, the people who have gone through this process, they are being rewarded. They've got the white robes and all that kind of stuff. Right? Do you notice they are given the white robe straight away? They have to wait a little longer for the fullness, but right now they get it. And they need to know that when the rest of the people are killed, that is actually something that God, he hasn't gone, oh wait, there's people dying? I wasn't prepared for that. No, it's all going to be part of his plan, and ultimately God will win. Okay? So, finally, where am I going with all of this? First of all, I think that it's helpful for us when we're reading Revelation to read it with this motif in our brain. The problem with Os Guinness's this or that fallacy is that what it lends you to do is to say that nothing is ever like anything in Revelation. This is never that. What I want to suggest is that this is always that. You will always find expressions, any time where you are in this period where people do not like that Christianity is winning, where everyone wants to make it that Christianity is losing, where hope is consistently dashed, where disappointment dictates so much of the practicalities of our age. This is saying to us, what Revelation is trying to say is, right now you are in this last period. You need to know that. But I have won. I am the Alpha and the Omega. I was dead and I came back to life, and I will come back. And in between, all it is about is you persevering in the hope of that and that. And so we're actually meant to read the four horsemen and identify people from right now. Not in a sense of, aha, so Jesus is coming back tomorrow, but rather to say, yeah, when that's happening, it's all part of the plan, and ultimately, if I hold true to the day Jesus comes back, whenever that may be, or the day that I die, whenever that may be, I will get the crown of life and I will have a white robe, and God will bring his justice. See, ultimately, I think that makes Revelation a book that we should all be reading. I think that's a book that, it actually makes it a book that is really encouraging in the midst of the despair, the defeat we often feel. And the great thing about it is that even in the midst of it, it does end with a window, however brief and fleeting and confusing and fascinating it may be. It does end with the window of that last moment. It does end with 21 and 22. Jesus has come, the last days are now, and the last of the last days will come. Hold true. Thanks.
Thanks very much for a very interesting talk. I must admit, it's a subject that I normally don't deal with, because it's sometimes I feel it's a bit of an apologetic embarrassment. But and so I'd rather talk about other things. I think you put it in to context fairly nicely. And it's something, even though I may not be totally comfortable with it, I'm more comfortable with that position than most others. Anyway, leave it open now for people to make comment or ask questions, and because we're kind of limited in the video audio equipment, I'll take this around, so please don't feel intimidated if I stick it in your face. Right.
If you think it's appropriate to discuss in the context of tonight, how do you respond to panmillennialism?
Right. Okay. Panmillennialism is lazy. So let me explain what panmillennialism is. Panmillennialism is pun, really, and what it is, it'll all pan out in the end, right? And it is usually associated with the kind of thing like the picture I gave of the computer game and the video game. So, taking a little bit of, showing you the hood of my talk. My talk was fundamentally what you would call an amillennial perspective on Revelation. Okay? So there's different types of that. And the ones that you would normally identify with kind of more apocalypticism kind of stuff, they're the opposite of amill. Right? I was coming from an amill perspective. Now, I think it's a really good point to bring up, Brian, because the risk of an amill perspective is that it tips over into the pan-mill one, where you just go, oh, well, none of those symbols mean anything great and apocalyptic in the last couple of weeks before Jesus comes back, so it'll all work out. That kind of laziness is the risk of amill. So part of what I'm trying to actually combat is the dangers of the excessive kind of apocalypticism, this is that kind of stuff that Os Guinness is talking about. But I'm actually trying to also combat the laziness of amills who just go, oh, it'll all work out, and I don't really need to read Revelation, and there's nothing relevant in it for me today anyway, so I'll just roll on. Both of those are actually unhealthy.
Can you just briefly summarise the various positions on that?
Yeah, just briefly. Just briefly summarise oh, wow. So when did they pick up the rocks? Well, it's a funny story. Okay, so there are effectively 4 main views. Let's go with that. The first view is a view that was more prevalent during the 1800s and that kind of thing, and that was called postmillennial. And what postmillennial did is it's a highly positive eschatology. That's the easiest way to frame it. What postmill says is that we will get everything awesome before Jesus comes back. Don't worry about the millennialism, the millennium itself. We'll just leave that out of it. The bottom line is that you do a this or that, this is that kind of thing if you're a post-mill, but what you do is you look for good news stories. So what you do is you say, hunger is being defeated. Jesus is coming back, right? That kind of a thing. You look for good news stories. That died out in World War I. Maybe by World War II. You have a few events like that, doesn't really go well for you. Now, the next option is premillennialism, and broadly speaking, premillennialism is a fundamentally negative eschatology. It does the this is that kind of thing, but it does it primarily from the perspective of something is going wrong in the world, that means Jesus is coming back. Okay? There are other dimensions to premillennial that fundamentally are about the nation of Israel and a few other facets, but the main thing for this talk is it's a negative eschatology. You're looking for the signs that Jesus is coming back are bad things. Then you have amillennial, which I've already represented tonight, which does not really frame things in those kind of terms, but sees that the millennium, the last days, is a dynamic that we are wrestling with ourselves. That the Bible, when it's talking about that, it's using that within the framework of Jesus has started it and he hasn't finished it on earth yet. And we're in this in-between time. The last one that I should probably mention is dispensationalism. Dispensationalism is a more specific version of premillennialism, that negative one, with a few added bonuses. The most evident bonus actually has to do with a little bit before Revelation, around 7 letters that are written by Jesus/John to several churches, and they identify those as specific periods. And lo and behold, we happen to be, based on that their timing with dispensationalists, we are in the last of those 7 periods. So most of those periods, with one exception, last around about 150 years. We're around about 140 years in. Right? So this adds to the sense of Jesus is coming. Look busy for a dispensationalist. Sorry. Oh, and I preface by just saying I hope that you understand speaking so briefly of each of those is not me disrespecting those, it's just trying to find a brief summary for them. So if you are a disp or a pre-mill or an A-mill or anything else, just understand that that's where I was coming from. So, good.
Thank you for your talk, Matthew. That was appreciated. From your studies, where do you think the rapture fits into all of this?
Okay. So the rapture is specifically discussed, like in its most explicit form, the rapture is discussed in Thessalonians, okay? And specifically in 2 Thessalonians, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm really going in at around about chapter 3, near the end of it. Now, the thing about that passage is it is full of symbolism. So if you actually look at it, it says the woman is about to have birth. You're going to be lifted up in the clouds, so you better put your armour on. Okay? So already you should see that just by that point, it's not necessarily meant to be a literal thing, that he's actually using a series of metaphors to make the same point. That would be certainly my perspective on it. I would add that N.T. Wright and other people like that who know a little bit about the New Testament.
That's what 1 Thessalonians 4 has just got the trumpet and the clouds and stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of symbolism being wrapped up there, and Paul is drawing from very commonly identified symbolism from the period to say, I mean, what's his main point? His main point to the Thessalonians more broadly is don't slack off. Okay, so their problem is not persevering, not because life gets too hard, but because for them, they actually want it to become too easy. So they don't want to work. And so his central thing is, those that don't work, don't eat. Still, pull your weight, lift your game, participate in society, be good for society. Don't just fob off because you think Jesus is coming back. Work hard. And so the point of that passage is around that kind of an approach to eschatology, which is a much broader point than the specifics of things like, whether we go up or down. Now, having said that, Wendy, a lot of the points that are made by people who are advocating around the rapture, I actually wholeheartedly agree with. And that's why I use that particular image. And I've used that in classes every single year that I've been here teaching. And the reason is because its key point, and the key point that the rapture is trying to make, that the kind of rapture theology that dispensationalists and premills use, is that don't get sucked into the world to the point where when Jesus comes back, you're disappointed. And that's a good message for anyone to hear, whether they're A-mill, dispy, anything else.
Yeah, thank you for the talk, Dr. Gray. I thought, could you maybe just elaborate a little bit on that rapture thing, I guess, and the idea of where it became more prevalent and when, and how it relates, I guess, to credibility, and we got those Left Behind books and those sorts of things, and then perhaps, if you don't mind, maybe if you could just comment briefly about reading Revelation through the lens of other books of the Bible, because sometimes it's associated with Daniel and some of the other stuff. So yeah, sorry, I got a 2 for 1.
And you're not even giving me the question that I was expecting you to give me, but. No, you'll have to be more explicit than that. Okay, so let's go with the two that we've given you. Okay, so the first question is, when did it come in? Well, clearly, if you read Tim LaHaye, around about 78 AD or something like that, when Paul was writing, because that's pretty much what Paul and Jesus were talking about. So we're done. I would respectfully disagree with that, and I would suggest that premillennialism as a major facet of Christian eschatological theology. Premillennialism is not very prevalent, and certainly dispensationalism is not at all prevalent. I'm just speaking as an historian here, just like I'm not arguing a case here, I'm just saying historically it's the case. It's not the main eschatological view of the Orthodox, which represents quite a lot of period. It's not really the main one of the Catholics. So historically, it's just not there for a long time. It's not been particularly prevalent, even within evangelicalism, until around about the 1790s. And the key reason for that is because in the 1790s, English evangelicalism was struck by a little thing happening over the other side of the English Channel. And they were so shocked by what was happening in France, they had to figure out how that made sense from a Christian perspective. And the main way that they made sense of that is through eschatology. And so what they argued was that was when you start the clock. Specifically around the whole 40 years thing. Now, you mentioned other biblical texts, so obviously the idea that Jesus would come back within 40 years of a specific period, that becomes the mainstream of evangelicalism. It switches from your kind of Jonathan Edwards, which is more post-mill, to in the 1780s it switches and it becomes much more pre-mill, and it remains remarkably prevalent within certainly English, but also Americans, until around about the 1850s. And the reason is because for 40 years, from about 1790 through to 1800, you've got like this 40 years, and people were saying Jesus will be coming back around about the 1830s or the 1840s. A little more broadly, that actually results in tremendous outworking by Christians. So even though they get it wrong, they do some pretty amazing stuff, not least of all convert much of the Southern Hemisphere. But it also leads to them having their own great disappointment. I mean, when did that happen? When did the Great Disappointment happen? 1844. Well, there's a whole host of those that happen afterwards, to the point where Spurgeon, who himself is probably attracted to premillennial theology, Spurgeon himself in like the 1850s says in a sermon, "We know not when Christ will come. The only reason why prophets write these books to tell us when he will come is for their own profit." Okay. So that leads to a lot of people being disillusioned, and then it kind of picks up a little later. So there you go. How's that?
Yes. Can I ask a question? You mentioned a king getting beheaded, so Charles I.
Yeah, Charles.
So what's the relationship between all this apocalypse and that event?
Yeah, why not? Okay, so you have to understand that the destabilising process of losing a monarch, no nation had done that for centuries. No nation had the kind of war where, like, you had rivals for a throne that would argue and everything like that, but to have a group that were essentially Republican, like the parliamentarians, defeat the king was just so unheard of. No one had any way of processing that. So when the English Civil War happened in 1632, and when it started, everyone was just thinking, like, we'll just give the king a rap on the knuckles, and then at the end of it, he'll pull his head in and everything will be fine. But things... Yeah, pull his head... Okay, bad choice of terms. Okay, he'll stop being a tool. He'll recognise that we live in a thing where the king and the parliament work together and everything will be fine. By the time that it escalates to the point where he is his army is obliterated and he is left with no authority and no power at all, no one knew how to frame that. So what started to happen is that little inklings of what's called the fifth monarchy theology started to pop in. I've talked about this before here. But the basic premise of that was, maybe this guy isn't just a lousy king, maybe he's the lousy king. Like in Daniel, there's these 4 kings, and the last one's a real snot bag. But once that snot bag comes, Jesus comes. This is how traditional way. The snot bag? Only if you understand the Aramaic. So the thing is that what happens is that starts to be the thing of, if we get rid of this guy, then actually this becomes the inauguration for the 5th king to come. And who's the 5th king? Jesus. Now, if you ask any good biblical scholar nowadays, they identify that those 4 are clearly meant to be culminating in like the Greeks or the Romans, which is when Jesus comes the first time. But that's not how these guys are reading it. Okay? So, again, this comes back to the credibility thing. That severely damaged the credibility of not only Cromwell's government, the guy who took over, but also of the very Christians who had done that kind of it, like the Puritans who had done it. It severely damaged their credibility for 20 or 30 years, if not indefinitely. You know, the credibility of your eschatology leads you to the point where you chop off a monarch's head. If that's the religion you're selling, it's not good.
Did Cromwell actually go down that path?
Yeah, he was part of the team that did it.
Yeah, but in terms of explaining in eschatology.
Oh, deeply. So, like, yeah, if you look at the Nominated Assembly of 1653, sorry, a little too much detail now. If you look at how they were framing things, it was deeply eschatological. So Cromwell had 3 parliaments, right? And all 3 of those were deeply eschatological in there. If you went into it, man, if you took one of our MPs and put them into that MP, or vice versa, there is very significantly different language being spoken, right? Now, admittedly, this is on one level ancient history, and you might not really care about it. It's like 450 years ago. But the key point with it for us here is that people are scared of Christians when they talk about Jesus coming back, because they've seen us do some pretty dangerous things. Because when Jesus is coming back, all bets are off. All niceties, all that kind of stuff, we usually go, well, he's coming back tomorrow. All the standard rules do no longer apply. And people are really worried that Christians will do that kind of thing and become quite violent. Okay? So part of what we have to do when we're explaining eschatology is say it in a way, I mean, you used the term before, I can't remember, but like in a sane way that doesn't make people think that we're actually going to become violent nutters. You know? The irony is that I actually think that the New Testament is pointing in that kind of a direction, that it's not about us being crazy nutters, it's about us being disciples of Jesus in the midst of adversity. You know? So, yeah.
That leads nicely into my question. I just wonder whether you've got any insight into why humans love to take the most grim reading of Revelation and use that as a distractor. I mean, we're supposed to be about doing things that Jesus wants us to do, and it seems like that grim reading robs us both of that impetus and of joy. Yeah. Why do we go that way?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah. I think it's a really interesting question. To be fair, I think part of the reason is because when you know that you're about to die, but you know all your family will keep on going, like when you know that you're about to be killed unjustly, but you also know your family are going and the people that you love, you want to find a way to make sense of that in a way that will make everything all right again. So that's the first dynamic. So the first dynamic is that the idea of the end of the world type stuff can be good, like attractive, not good, attractive to people in terms of the pessimism, because what we can say is, yeah, it's bad right now, and it's going to get worse, and it's going to get worse for everybody. The tool who's killing me, and for everyone else. But you know what? Then it'll get better. So that's the first point. But then there's another point, and that is, there's actually been an increasing amount of literature that is just starting to come out about what's called secular apocalypticism. And it's the growing obsession with trying to say that we're going to, like, things are going to get really bad. You see it in terms of global warming stuff. I'm not talking about whether global warming is real or not or anything like that. I'm just saying the desperate attraction to believe that next year is going to be the end, you know, that kind of a thing. The dire warnings that, you know, I saw an article, a parody article the other day that was saying, you know, scientists unequivocally proved that global warming will take over and ruin the world in 2015. You know, and the point is, 3 years ago? Yeah, but it will. But it's already been passed. The point is that there's this wider secular attraction to saying the end of the world is nigh. You can see it also in the rise of apocalyptic film, like films like the Terminator series or something like that, that desperately wants to say, okay, well, when the world completely disintegrates and the nice, comfortable Western world that we have is just ruined by a nuclear fallout or something like that, how will we cope? And part of the question with that is, we've been talking about the Christian desire for an end of the world and for everything to go bad and then get good again. What is the wider societal attraction to saying we've got a good thing going here, like we live in a comfortable Western affluent society? When will it just ruin and get screwed up? Why do we have that attraction to that? Well, part of that is because we realise, from a Christian perspective, we realise that we live with our own fallen sinfulness. And there's this sense that we shouldn't really have it that good on one level, right? And why is that? Because we all know that we're sinners and we're broken. And we also know that often the just and wonderful life that we live is actually unjust, in the sense that there are people around the world who don't get to have what we have. And we feel guilty about that. And so actually, that sense of apocalypticism more broadly is built on biblical ideas about anthropology, about our humanity. That we recognise that this isn't heaven. Like, this isn't the new age of Christ coming back. And that we're never going to get that here. And any time where we see some of it, it's all going to break eventually. Somehow. We'll screw it up, because that's what we do, because we're humans. And that ultimately, in the midst of our hope for, you know, medical advance and everything like that, we ultimately know that we don't actually have the capacity to not ruin things. Because we're sinful and we're broken and we need Jesus.
Thank you, Matt. Your comments about that cyclical pattern of dictators, war, famine and death doesn't fit with what we see of the world, because what we don't see is how much our Western media is closed into the West. And there are two factors in this which I would suggest show that this, and the other comments about the dead Christians, is significant, dead martyrs. The first is that about 10 years ago, an historian in History Today published his studies of the history of war on the face of the globe since the end of World War II, and he got 3 surprises out of it. The first surprise was there has never been less than 52 wars on the face of the globe at any time since the end of World War II. The second thing was how few of these wars get reported in the Western media. And the third thing was the wars that are reported are all from the same area. The second factor in all of this with the martyrdom is that I have some Greek Orthodox friends who track martyrdom going on at the moment, which is not reported in the Western media, and they record the millions of Christians killed in the last 10 years in 43 countries around the world.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think it comes to the point about the significance of this as opposed to a secular worldview. Why this is really important. Okay, so part of the growing thing that we have, and it's a good thing within our Western society, is the thing that those who do wrong should be known. They should be named and they should be shamed. I mean, go on Twitter for 5 minutes. Okay, like, we want things to be dealt with, and we have an instinct that says that that's the right thing to do. At the same time, there's a heck of a lot of wrong going on in the world. And so what the media is left with is the tension between we all have this instinct to know and shame and make right the wrongs that are happening in the world. We have no capacity to do so. So what we do is we choose those that we think people will find most interesting, and maybe one or two exotic ones just to spice things up a little every now and again. Okay? So what that actually ultimately means is that a lot of the gross human rights injustices and wars and things like that never get reported. Well, if we're living in an entirely secular worldview, the fact that those things never get reported is the ultimate injustice and the ultimate tragedy, because we have this instinct that says they should be reported, they should be made known, but we don't do it. We don't have the capacity to do it. So there's that. What this passage speaks to us and says is, yes, you're right, they should be known, they should be named, they should be made right. And they are known, and they are named, and they will be made right. That, I think, is actually a really important point for us. So when I hear of, the hundreds of thousands of Christians, millions of Christians who are dying right now, I know that passage speaks to me of they have their white robes on now, and they're waiting, but they know that God is bringing around his justice. And when I hear of the wars that are happening, I know that none of that is missed. It might be missed by the media, but if I'm expecting the media to do the job that God has said that he'll do, it just doesn't have the capacity for that. It's unfair for me to expect that of them. Now, that doesn't mean they shouldn't name more and they shouldn't actually expose us to more of the ugly side of life. But it does mean we can't expect too much of them.
Yeah, likewise, Matt. Thanks for this. You actually already touched on the area I was going to bring up, which is, you called it secular eschatology. And you even named Terminator, I've been looking at both from the AI and how so much of what's coming out of California, therefore so much of what infiltrates our media and our social media. And I started thinking that maybe this apocalyptic bent of our society was growing. I got convinced of it listening to the Guardian Science Weekly a couple of weeks ago, where most of the pro-Mars mission is because people are convinced we're going to wipe ourselves out. Yeah. Doesn't this give us an opportunity for bringing out a justice and because that's the thing that you're alluding here to, right? Those martyrs are waiting for justice, and people, haven't we sort of made God this like warm, comfortable little daddy instead of a just God? So here's my question with that as a background. Given if our society, our secular society, is becoming growingly apocalyptic, and we have a story that we've avoided for so long because we can't agree about the details, do we have an apologetic opportunity rather than embarrassment here? And if so, how do we go about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I see where you're going with that, Tom. I think we do. And I think, with all due respect to people from a different theological position, I think that starts by us majoring on the majors of our eschatology and not majoring on the minors of our eschatology. Because actually, look, at the end of the day, if I sit down with a premill or a dispensationalist, if they say to me, so Matt, do you believe that that there is injustice in the world that is not representative of what God's on about? I go, well, yeah. If they say, do you believe that Jesus will come one day? I go, well, yeah. Do you believe that could be soon? Well, yeah. And do you believe that when he comes, he will make everything right? Yeah. And do you think that part of him making things right is to judge evil and punish it? Yeah. Well, actually, in terms of answering the kind of thing that you're talking about, the difference between amillennialism and premillennialism is not actually that significant. So if we majored on those key points, then when we come to our people who are non-Christians, the pre-mill, the dispensationalists and the amill, could actually speak to someone who's saying, look, I'm really worried about the rise of AI, the reality of people wanting to get off this planet because they're pretty sure we're going to stuff it up, the rise of global warming, everything like that. The world ain't right, man. And we may have it affluent, but really, eventually, someone's going to come from the poorer countries and they're going to come and say, it's not right that you have all of this, and all of this will go wrong, whatever it may be. And for us to say to them, and then for them to say to us, let me put it those ways, do you agree with that? And we to go, yeah, we all agree that the world isn't right. Okay, but you know what? We can all also agree with that? That Jesus will win, that Jesus has won, and that one day he will make things right. And he will hold people accountable for their injustices. And that you can come to live in his grace right now. Now, none of us are compromising anything when we say that. What would be frustrating is having got the person to go, wow, that sounds like a really cool message, for us to then say, and now let's really confuse you with a bunch of stuff that we can't even agree on and we're really not sure is actually right anyway. So part of it is the restraint to know when is a fun time to play a little bit of eschatological, theological hockey and play around, and I'll play with the dispensationalist and he'll have a poke at me and everything like that. To know when that is an okay thing to do and when it's not appropriate and it's not constructive. So,
with the view that God is going to sort everything out, can't that become a lazy position and where you're not trying to address the injustice in the world, acting on it?
Yep, so that's a really good point. And yes, it can. The other facet, and this comes to the other thing of when we are in the last days, we are meant to be foretastes of that end. See, let me put it this way. Imagine you represent an emperor. I've used this analogy before here, but we'll work with it. Imagine that you represent an emperor who has just won the battle. We'll call him King Jesus, for the sake of it. And you walk into a village and you say to them, congratulations, King Jesus has won the battle, and I'm here to set things up for when he arrives. He is coming. Then, right, you see how I'm going? Then it's actually not our job just to tell people that he's coming. It's actually our job to prepare the way for him to come and to make it more the way he wants it to be run. If he likes plumbing to be done in a certain way, or he doesn't like building codes to be like this and he wants them better, well, it's our job to actually make them more the way the emperor wants them. So it's our job to bring pockets of the kingdom and to shape things more to his kingdom's liking through advocacy, evangelism, and all this kind of stuff, right? Because the opposite of that is for us to go, well, we'll just bed down and become like everybody else. Well, then we know that we're actually aligning ourselves with the losing team. We know that he has come, so he will come. He has won, so he will win.
Better make this the last question. You have the honour.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. I'm probably in the minority in this group from what I can gather. I am a premillennial, pre-trib rapture, and I am a dispensationalist. And the reason I am that is because I read the Bible literally. I take, when it says a quarter, like a fourth of the population of the world will die by the sword and pestilence and famine and so on, I take it as a quarter of the population. When Jesus said, In Matthew 24, I can't remember the exact verse, he said, "For then there shall be a great tribulation, such as not been up to this time, nor ever shall be." He's speaking about a specific period of time. And then if you put Daniel together with the book of Revelation, it talks about the 7 years, like 1 week, Daniel 9:27, 1 week is like 7 years, or the 3.5 years, or the 1,260 days. I take that to mean 1,260 days. And when in Revelation chapter 20, it says that Jesus will rule and reign for 1,000 years, I take that to mean 1,000 years. In fact, the first 5 verses, it mentions 1,000 years 5 times or 6 times or whatever. So I take that to, when the Bible says such and such in a literal way, I take it literally. Sure. Just like Jesus, like in the first coming of Christ, like Prophet Micah said that the Messiah was going to be born in Bethlehem. He was literally born in Bethlehem. When Isaiah chapter 53, it says that the Lord laid on him, and the man, actually Psalm 22 talks about that Jesus will, his hands and his feet will be pierced. And Zechariah talks about that, they shall look upon me whom they have pierced. So Jesus was literally pierced at the cross. It talks about that Jesus was a descendant of King David, the son of David, of the tribe of Judah, of Abraham. All of those things were literally fulfilled at his first coming. So I have every reason to believe that Jesus will fulfill all the outstanding prophecies concerning his second advent, or second coming, will be literally fulfilled.
Okay, yeah. Right, this is really hot.
Very well expressed.
Yeah. So, first thing to say is fair enough. Okay? On one level, as I said before, while we might disagree on certain specifics, it is really important that we recognise that there are key facets of this that we do still wholeheartedly agree on that are very important. Not least of all, that Jesus ultimately wins. That's the first thing for us to recognise. And I think that's an important thing so that we don't get into arguments too much and actually, in that sense, damage the credibility of the gospel. Because one of the key things that God wants in this is for unity to be represented amongst his people. Right, so that's the first thing. Second thing is, I have no problem with the concept that that certain facets of the symbolism that's used in the Bible, in terms of the second coming, may turn out to be extremely literal. No problem, precisely for the point that you make. Some of the ones about Christ's first advent are extremely literal. Literal. Whoops. Right, extremely literal. Right? Yeah. But here's the thing. There are other aspects of what it says about Christ's first coming that aren't literal. That he is the root, right, that will come out. That's actually deliberately symbolic. It's not like he's a tree that comes out. That's actually an important it's meant to be taken symbolically, and we have to respect it symbolically. I'm not saying anything that the root of Jesse will flourish and bloom or things like that. Those kind of terms are clearly actually not meant to be taken literally. They're symbolic of stuff. That's not something that a dispensationalist, I would imagine, would have much of a problem with. It's fair enough. So the question is, which ones are going to be literal and which ones are the ones that are going to be symbolic? And I guess what I'm trying to say on one level is that I am pretty darn sure that godly people from the time of Jesus' day would have found that just as dumbfounding and confounding for them to figure out. And so I want to have the same humility about Christ's second advent as they hopefully had about his first one, to the point where on one level they were able to go afterwards in retrospect, oh, so of course that one was literal. Oh, I should have seen all along, but I understand why I didn't beforehand. So part of it is a little degree of humility from my perspective to do that. The last thing that I'll say is this, that the Bible, about the literal thing, I respect that concept on one level, except that the other facet with the Bible is not one tool. The Bible is a toolkit, in that there are a variety of genres represented in it, and those genres have different rules and aspects to them. And so one danger is if you treat all of the scriptures by one set of rules, such as, just in terms of saying all scripture must be read literally, the danger with that, this isn't so much a criticism of your point, it's where I see a lot of other people use this thing. Where a lot of other people use this is they start to say, well, I'm just reading the Bible literally, so therefore it has to always be read there, and they have no room for symbolism. This isn't so much your specific point, it's just a qualification that I think both of us can agree on. We don't want to see people do that to the point where what they do is they treat the Bible as one kind of thing, one genre, without respecting that. Because then what it is like me looking at my toolkit and saying, oh no, all that I've got in there is a hammer, and then I start going to a screw that needs a screwdriver and just hammering it in. And that's ultimately not going to be good for the screwdriver or for the hammer or the screw. We have to respect genre. That's the only point that I'm making there. And it's one that I think most people from any perspective would be able to respect. Right? Sure.
Of course, the context determines whether we take something literally or figuratively or symbolic. Like when Jesus said, I am the door, he didn't mean that he's a literal door. When Jesus said, I am the vine, it didn't mean he's a bunch of grapes, or that he's the light of the world. He's like a light bulb. So obviously the text, the context determines how you interpret it. So for me, the book of Revelation is quite plain. If you come understand it from a literal point of view, there is a chronological order to it. There's the first 3 chapters, Jesus introducing himself to John, and then the 7 churches, and then chapter 4 right up to chapter 17, the church is not mentioned. There's going to be all kinds of things happening with the seal judgment, bowl judgment, trumpet judgment, so forth, every time Jesus opened up the scroll. And then Jesus returns in chapter 19, and then chapter 20 talks about the millennial kingdom of Christ for 1,000 years of peace and righteousness, which is what the Jewish people have been expecting in the Old Testament, because the church age is a mystery. Jesus will establish the offer of the kingdom was rescinded to the nation of Israel because they rejected him as their Messiah. So the offer was temporarily withdrawn, but will be reoffered to them during the tribulation, which is when the nation of Israel will, in Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10, they shall look upon me whom they have pierced and mourn for him as one mourns for his only son. And so therefore when the Jewish nation as a whole, corporate nation, when they finally trust in Jesus as their Messiah, believe in him as their Savior, then Jesus will return and offer the kingdom to Israel, and once again Jesus will reign on the throne of David. Just like, and then 1,000 years are up, and then you get the great white throne judgment, which is chapter 20 at the end of it, and then chapter 21 we get new heaven and new earth and so forth. So that's the way I interpret it. I mean, you don't have to agree with me, but that's my position. In fact, the way I came to Christ, in fact, this is not a matter of agree to disagree, perhaps, but for me, the fact that I was watching the news about Israel, that all nations are coming against, United Nations, Israel gets condemned at the expense of, and like Israel gets condemned for daring to defend themselves against the terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah and all of that. And so therefore, I could see what the Bible says. And then there is Ezekiel 38 and 39, the Gog and Magog invasion. You got Russia, Iran, Turkey, these countries coming together against Israel. They're making threats all the time. To me, it's literally coming true. And then the Jewish nation, the Orthodox Jews, want to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, right on the Temple Mount. And so therefore, that you can all go to the Temple Institute website and look at all the things that they're preparing for. These are all literally, I mean, you mentioned AI, artificial intelligence. That also is coming true. Sorry. I apologize.
No, it's okay. You expressed it very well.
Yeah, I'm done. It's okay.
You're done. Good. Okay. So if you'd like to kind of have a chat with Matt afterwards, then that'd be great.